Okay, welcome. So we are on part 2 of the real business cycle model now. Last time we talked about some of the assumptions of the model. We set up the way that we would solve the model for the household, and we got a couple of first-order conditions for the household. We got an Euler equation for capital. We got a labor supply equation. We got an Euler equation for bonds and one for money. So this is kind of where we left off last week. So this time what we're going to do is we're going to expand on these first order conditions a little bit, and then we're going to move on to the firm's optimization problem. And when we get that, we can then start to talk about the general equilibrium of the model. And with that general equilibrium, the idea is that we're going to have every equation that's relevant to the model. So you're going to have labor demand, labor supply, aggregate demand, aggregate supply, money demand. Now, I don't really worry about money supply here because the central bank is going to be setting the money supply equal to money demand in every period. But that's kind of the way that this is going to work. So we're going to close the model out by having every relevant equation to this particular system. And when we do that, we can then start to talk about how shocks are going to be transmitting through the model. And interestingly, and fortunately for us, the shocks aren't going to be all that different than what we've been seeing in other models like the neoclassical growth model. So let's start talking about capital for a second. So with capital, we had our Euler equation. And this, if we were doing something like with the neoclassical growth model, where it was a centralized model that we were solving, you'd be seeing equation 5. We've seen this with the neoclassical growth model. Now, the cool thing is that the Euler equation for capital in this model is, let's skip back over a few slides. Here we go. RT plus 1 minus delta. Whereas here, for the neoclassical growth model, it was A times K to the alpha minus 1, or alpha times A times K to the alpha minus 1. Kind of like what we see here. So what this is telling me is that if we go back again to equation 1, this is the Euler equation for capital. This is the Euler equation for capital in the neoclassical growth model. That tells me that the marginal product of capital, all right, the amount that one additional unit of capital will be adding to production, is equal to the real interest rate that we see in equation 1. So this alpha times A times K to the alpha minus 1 is equal to RT plus 1. Therefore, the marginal product of capital is equal to the real interest rate. So this equation is telling me that the household chooses to invest in capital up until the point the marginal product of consumption today is equal to the marginal product of consumption tomorrow, weighted by time preferences and market conditions and depreciation. So if RT plus 1 goes up, then that means we're going to save more and consume less today so that we can consume more tomorrow. So that was for capital. Let's talk about this labor thing. I said it was labor supply. And how do we know it's labor supply? Well, there's a couple of ways we can tell. First, we know that it's going to be some kind of labor demand or labor supply because if you look at equation 6, I've got two key variables in there. I've got the wage rate and I've got labor. So I've got the price of labor and the quantity of labor. That should automatically tell you, boom, hey, we're in like labor demand, labor supply space. So then the question is this going to be labor demand or is this labor supply? Well, it's labor supply because this is a decision being made by the household. If you're a household, right, which you are at least an agent within the household. If somebody was like, hey, are you making labor demand or labor supply decisions? Well, if you have a job, you're making labor supply decisions. So the household is making decisions based on how much labor they want to supply to the firm. Now, we haven't gotten to the firm yet, but trust me, the firm is here, and we'll be playing with that in just a second. So what this equation here is telling me is the wage rate times the marginal utility of consumption, that W over C. Because remember, the marginal utility of consumption is 1 over C. So the wage rate times the marginal utility of consumption is equal to the elasticity of substitution of leisure for consumption, theta, divided by leisure, which was 1 minus labor. In English, this is an equilibrium condition in which the agent is willing to work. If the agent sees a high enough wage, they're going to want to work more. Why? Well, if I'm offering, let's say I need somebody to help me grade exams. Now, it would be for the other class I'm teaching, not for this class, because it would be unethical for you to grade exams for this class. So for the other class I'm teaching, I need somebody to grade that exam for me. If I offered you $1 an hour to do it, I'm pretty sure every single one of you would say no. You'd be like, it's not worth it. I'll get something else. Now, if I were to offer any one of you $40 an hour to work, you'd probably be like, whoa, okay, I think I'm going to go work for him now. And I'm going to be a really good worker because that's good money. I want to keep making that $40 an hour. So if I do a good job now, maybe he'll keep paying me $40 an hour to grade other exams. So somewhere between that $1 an hour and that $40 an hour is that cutoff point, that point where you would be indifferent between working and not working. Let's say it's $12.37 an hour. At $12.36 an hour, you're going to go, I don't want to work. It's not worth it to me. At $12.38 an hour, you're like, I am definitely going to work. And at $12.37 an hour, you are perfectly indifferent between working and not working. The slightest tipping point, one way or the other, would push you in the direction of either working or not working. That $12.37 an hour, in this case, would be your reserve wage. Under a reserve wage, the agent doesn't want to work unless they're offered a high enough wage to do so. Another way would be like, let's say you work in an office, right? And your boss wants to give you a promotion. And, the office you work in is maybe something like this. I don't know. Your boss wants to give you a promotion. That means a lot more responsibility. You have to make more important decisions, and if you screw up, the company suffers a lot for it, and a lot of people can lose their jobs. That's a lot of responsibility to put on somebody. Not to mention, that's also a skill set that you're acquiring that is going to be valuable to other companies. So if the company that you work for wants to keep you, what are they going to do? They're going to give you more money. So you're going to demand more money, right? You're like, I want more money for this job. Now, like I said, fortunately, the firm's smart enough to recognize that if they keep paying you crap wages for more and more responsibility, somebody else is going to see the value in what you're doing, and they're going to pay you more to go work over there. So your company's going to pay you more. So far, we have the first order conditions for capital bonds, or for capital and labor. Let's get on to bonds and money. Actually, let's not do that. Let's stay on the labor supply stuff for just a minute. Here's the interesting thing. I said this in the last lecture. There are no t plus 1s here. It's just t. So equation 6, WT, CT, LT. Those are the only time varying variables here. Wages, consumption, and labor. There is no t plus 1 in there. So this is a static equation. This is not an Euler equation. It's telling me that the agent chooses how much to work each period based on the going wage rate. Now, in the real world, this isn't totally accurate. We've got things like wage contracts, and there are bosses who, schedule you, and maybe you don't have a real say in when you get to work. Like if you work in a restaurant, I used to do that, and that was, I get my schedule every week, and I'm like, God damn it, I got to go work, Monday and like Tuesday night or something. I really don't want to work those nights, but you just kind of have to, so you just go in there. These things, these abstractions from the assumptions of this model, they're called rigidities. And so this model makes a lot of simplifying assumptions, perhaps too many simplifying assumptions, as we'll learn a little bit later. But a good way to think of this model is how the world would be if it were perfect. So we understand this model isn't going to perfectly fit the data because it makes perhaps too many simplifying assumptions, but it's at least enough realistic assumptions that maybe it can fit the data in response to certain types of shocks. So I'm going to take equation 6 and I'm going to rewrite it to get equation 7. What did I do? Well, I multiplied both sides by consumption. So now I've got the wage rate being a function of the elasticity of labor supply divided by 1 minus labor multiplied by consumption. So this says that the wage rate that will induce me to work is a function of the elasticity of substitution between labor and consumption. I think I said the elasticity of labor supply. It's the elasticity of labor and consumption, labor itself, and then consumption. So if I want to consume more, right, if I want to consume more stuff, what is this going to do to the wage rate? It's going to increase it. You kind of see the way that this whole thing is working now. So if you want to consume more stuff, well, you're going to need a higher wage rate to induce you to work. So the idea here is that the household is deciding to supply labor based on the going wage rate and their preferences for leisure, 1 minus labor, and consumption. Okay, so let's talk about this third first order condition we have. I said it was labor here. It is not labor. That is definitely bonds. Here we go, bonds. What do you know? Just the magic of editing. Voila, it's fixed. So this is the third first order condition we had. This is our second Euler equation. This is telling me the agent's going to buy bonds until the marginal utilities of consumption today and tomorrow are equal, weighted by time preferences and the real interest rate. So you remember that whole time that I said this was like the Euler equation in like a decentralized system? Hey, told you I wasn't lying. So let's spend some more time on this. Actually, let's not. Let's just move on to money. So the money Euler equation said what you see in equation 9. The marginal utility of consumption today is equal to beta times tomorrow's marginal utility of consumption weighted by inflation plus gamma over MT plus 1. Now, gamma, if you remember, is the elasticity of substitution between money holdings and consumption. Or another way to think of it, gamma is like the usefulness of money. How useful is money to us? Now, you might be going like, all right, well, what is that? What is this whole money thing? You kind of know what money is. Don't worry. We're going to be learning a little bit more about money later on in the semester. But right now, just think of this as how useful money is to us. And this MT plus 1, just like capital and just like bonds, it's a state variable. So MT was chosen yesterday. MT plus 1 gets chosen today. The money holdings themselves, think of this as like having money in your savings account, right? You like to have some real money balances in your savings account that you can fall back on for like a rainy day fund. That's basically what MT plus 1 is here. So in English, equation 9 is telling me that you're going to hold money until you're indifferent between holding money or consuming more stuff. Well, I mean, that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? You're going to want to have some savings up to the point where you're indifferent between saving an additional dollar and spending that additional dollar on a consumer good instead, right? Do you want to save it for a rainy day, or do you want to just consume everything now? You get up to that point where you're indifferent, well, that is now being defined by this Euler equation. Now, we're going to be talking about the money supply at least a little bit later. But the idea is that the government is simply going to be supplying money equal to the demand for money. They just set it equal to money demand, and that's it. That's the end of the story within this model. So this right here, equation 9, if we were to solve everything for MT plus 1, boom, that would be a money demand function right there. But we're not going to worry too much about that. So let's recap for everything that we've done so far. We have the household, and the household optimizes. We get a couple of important functions out of this. We get like a capital supply equation where we supply capital to the firm based on market conditions. We get a labor supply equation in which the agent supplies labor to the firm based on the going wage rate. We get like a demand for bonds equation in which the agent buys bonds from firms or governments based on the going interest rate on those bonds. And we get like a money demand equation in which the agent demands real money balances based on their preferences for consumption and the inflation rate. With a higher inflation rate, you're going to want more money. But all this is only part of the story because we need firms next, right? So far, all we've done is the household. We need firms to give us the other side of the economy. Now, we're going to assume that there's just one representative firm. We did the same thing with a household, if you remember. It was just one household. So here it's just one firm. And the firm has access to the production technology that we've seen a lot this semester. Y equals A times K to the alpha times L to the 1 minus alpha. And they're going to face costs of capital and labor. So for each unit of capital, they need to pay a rental rate of R, or the real interest rate. For each hour of labor, they have to pay a real wage rate, W. So in real terms, their costs are the real interest rate times the amount of capital they use plus the real wage rate times the amount of labor they use. And they're going to be maximizing their profits in this model. So what is profit? Well, profit is total revenue minus total cost. And total revenue is output times price. Well, output is equation 10. So if we multiply equation 10 by the price level, well, that's going to be P times A times K to the alpha times L to the 1 minus alpha. And in nominal terms, because we're looking at this profit in nominal terms right now, it would be P times output minus the nominal interest rate times capital minus the nominal wage rate times labor. And the first order conditions in nominal terms would be price times the marginal product of labor, or marginal product of capital, sorry, this is the marginal product of capital here, equals the nominal interest rate. And then we also have price times the marginal product of labor equals the nominal wage rate. So if you're like, well, wait a minute, I thought, we had, this stuff was real here, but then you're like, screw it, go all Leroy Jenkins, now we've got nominal stuff here. Well, I'm actually showing you how we get to the real stuff. Because if you remember, converting between nominal and real, what are we doing? Well, we're adjusting for the change in price. We're adjusting for the price level. So if we're converting from a nominal to real variable, what do? Well, we divide by the price level. If we've got something in period T and a price level in period T, well, we just divide that variable in period T by the price level. If it's T plus 1 in period, in like the price level period T, say RT plus 1 rather than RT, dividing by PT, well, then that's where the inflation adjustment needs to come in. But if it's the same period, right, RT and PT, divide by PT, boom, you get a real variable. So we're going to take equations 14 and 15 and divide them by the price level. So now I get the marginal product of capital equals the nominal interest rate divided by the price level, and the marginal product of labor equals the nominal wage rate divided by the price level. Well, the nominal interest rate divided by the price level is the real interest rate, and the nominal wage rate divided by the price level is the real wage rate. So equation 18 is a restatement of equation 16, and equation 19 is a restatement of equation 17. So now I have the real interest rate being equal to the marginal product of capital. And I also have the nominal or the real wage rate being equal to the marginal product of labor. So equation 18, let's cut all the way back to equation 1. RT plus 1 in equation 1 and RT in equation 18. If you were to just add 1 to all the t subscripts in equation 18, that gives you the Euler equation in equation 1, RT plus 1. So, let's just tell them, okay, here we are. Wait. Slide 16, equation 18. RT is equal to the marginal product of labor today. Tomorrow's marginal product of labor is equal to RT plus 1. Therefore, this is the decentralized version of the neoclassical growth model. Kind of interesting, isn't it? So when it's decentralized, first off, the firm is doing its optimization, and the household's not really doing it like for the firm. Next, you also have labor in the model now. So the household's deciding its labor supply stuff, and the firm is getting its labor demand, which will really be coming from equation 19. Therefore, you set them equal to each other. Well, now you've got this like general equilibrium with capital markets and labor markets. But that's being done in the decentralized system. The centralized system was all kind of internalized in the household's constraint. So the firm's marginal products of capital and labor are equal to the real interest rate and the real wage rate. And here we've just maximized profit for the firm, which gives us a set of conditions we can use to get an equilibrium in the markets. So if you remember, the marginal product of labor is equal to the real wage rate. The real wage rate was also equal to theta over 1 minus L times C. So we can just set equations 20 and 21 equal to each other. So labor demand for the firm is equal to the real wage rate and can be set equal to labor supply from the household, which is also equal to the real wage rate. So here's an equilibrium condition in the labor markets. This is labor demand equals labor supply. That's kind of interesting, I think. We can also do this for capital, but there's something cool about this with capital. The cool thing here is that for capital, the interest rate is the same for capital and bonds. So we end up having an indeterminacy of how the firm finances its projects. This is what's known as the Modigliani-Miller hypothesis. Very strongly paraphrased, it states that it doesn't matter if the firm finances its projects by issuing debt or equity, because the value of the firm would be unaffected either way. Kind of interesting when you think about it. Okay, so what's the government doing here? Well, just like what they do in real life. Absolutely nothing. He's not going to like that. Neither is he. Yep, this pretty much describes the government in this model, almost to a T. Just replace that E with a G, and that is definitely the government. You know what? I'm not going to say that's a bad joke. I thought it was pretty good, actually. But in all honesty, the government doesn't do anything in this model. And I'm not saying that to be like, oh, the government doesn't ever do anything, and they're just crap. I actually mean they're not doing anything in this model because everything they do is exogenous. They tax and borrow, but it's not done in response to anything or anyone in the model. There's no endogenous response function for the government in this model. We'll get to that when we learn about the new Keynesian model. And there's this thing called Ricardian equivalence that also holds. And essentially, Ricardian equivalence says that the timing of government expenditures doesn't matter because the household is internalizing the government's budget constraint. So if the government, say, borrows a bunch of money today to fund a project, to say, I don't know, build a bridge, then the household's going to go, all right, well, the government borrowed it today, which means they're going to have to pay it back in taxes tomorrow. So I'm not going to consume any more today because I'm going to have to pay it all back tomorrow anyways. Additionally, if the government taxes a lot today to build a new bridge for tomorrow, the household's going to go, well, they're taxing a lot today, and I'm not going to have to pay additional money tomorrow. So my consumption patterns, again, aren't going to change. It's essentially Ricardian equivalence. But the government doesn't play any serious role in this model. There's not like an equation in this model. They just sort of like exist. Now, I'm not saying this to be like the government's bad, and I'm not teaching this to like make you hate the government or think that they're totally useless or anything like that. This is just a simplified model, and it assumes perfect competition and flexible prices, and both welfare theorems hold. So if all that happens, there's no need for the government in this model to try to improve economic welfare because there's no economic welfare to improve. Everything is as efficient as it can possibly be, regardless of whether the economy is in a recession or not in a recession. It's a perfectly efficient equilibrium, regardless. So what do we do? Well, now we're just going to need to collect all the equations and get the equilibrium conditions. And in the last chapters, we just had like one optimization problem to sort of put all the equations together, which is neat, but it didn't get the point of the general equilibrium across all that well. It just kind of showed you how to do a bunch of math, and it didn't really get to the point that everyone's separately optimizing and we're getting this like simultaneous equilibrium thing going on. But the RBC model gives us a better indicator of how this is all going on. We get a better view, a better grasp of what's happening. Because households and firms are optimizing, governments are just sort of there, and then they all come together and they give us a general equilibrium. And this right here is the general equilibrium. So equation 23, this is the Euler equation for capital that the household derived. Equation 24 is an equilibrium in the labor market. So I've got labor supply, that theta over 1 minus L times C, equals essentially labor demand, 1 minus alpha times A times K to the alpha times L to the minus alpha. And that's equal to the real wage rate. I have investment, which describes the flow of capital over time. I have output, y equals A times K to the alpha times L to the 1 minus alpha, in equation 26. Equation 27, this is the resource constraint. This ensures that output isn't exceeded by the sum of consumption and investment. Equation 28, that is my Euler equation for bonds. So this is going to tell me how I want to buy bonds. Equation 29, this is the marginal product of capital being equal to the real interest rate. So you can sort of think of this as like a demand for capital, so to speak. And then equation 30 is money demand. So with these equations right here, we would have the model closed out in a deterministic form. If it was stochastic, things would be a little different, but we're not playing with stochastics here, so don't worry about that. Though, all this said, this is the general equilibrium. So if we were to change a variable, if we were to increase or decrease something, it would feed through this entire system. So if you were to change a variable, let's say we were to increase A, total factor productivity, we could see how it feeds through the entire system of equations. It would start in the production function. So equation 26, you would see this increase in A. And from there, well, it would expand the resource constraint, equation 27, so it frees up more for consumption and investment. Thus, it's going to be affecting the Euler equation for capital. It's going to affect labor demand. It's going to affect essentially the demand for capital, because if firms can produce more, if each unit is more productive at the margin, well, they're going to want more inputs. They're going to want more capital. They're going to want more labor. So equation 29 increases, equation 24 increases. Labor demand goes up, capital demand goes up. Well, the household is willing to supply more capital because the interest rate on that is going up, so they're going to supply more capital to the firm. They're also willing to supply more labor to the firm because the wage rate goes up. So if the wage rate goes up, well, they're like, hey, cool, we're just going to work more because we're going to get paid more to do it. And from there, think about how every other equation would respond. Try to like reason through, okay, what is this equation telling me? If I know what this equation's telling me, if I know what it is, how is it going to be affecting X, Y, or Z? Now, think also about maybe a shock to theta, which would be a shock to labor markets rather than the production function. This can either be thought of as like a labor supply shock or an increase in the willingness of people to work. If you're more willing to work, you're just like, screw it, I'm going to supply more labor to the firm because, well, I just feel like working more. Then that would be an increase in theta. You can also think of it as like, and this isn't so much on the per household level, this is more like if you're looking at it like in an aggregate form, a labor supply shock would be like, a bunch of people come into the country and want to work. But this wraps up the lecture for now. There's going to be one more lecture on this chapter, then we get to the graphing. And the graphing shows us the static responses to shocks. And we can then trace out these static responses to shocks by looking at like the dynamic responses. So we can go like, all right, the static responses, it's like this in one point in time, then this in one point in time, and this in one point in time. And you can go, okay, well, this went up a little bit more, and then it started to go down. From there, you can trace out what the dynamic responses are, and then we can begin to tie some empirical evidence to the real business cycle model. We can see if it fits, where it doesn't fit. Once we're done with that, that's going to wrap up the section for this course. So it's just a couple more weeks of this, and then I guess another exam for you. But hey, at least this exam is going to be easier for you. I promise you that. Then we move on to the new Keynesian model, which is where we'll wrap up for the remainder of that's going to be the end of the semester, basically. So I hope you enjoyed this. Be on the lookout. There's one more of these videos coming on Thursday. And in the meantime, enjoy the space in between this video and the next. Thanks for watching. Bye.